On the 3rd of May 2011, Terrorwars released a standalone expansion. This was Mount and Blade with Fire and Sword. These years later, it doesn't seem to have been as successful as Warband and of course Napoleonic Wars. It seems to have been pretty much dead for quite some time. So today in this video, I'm going to be going over analysing why that has happened and getting your responses, since I've done a big survey with you guys to try and find out why. Now, of course, I think it's granted, this is going to be mostly focusing on the multiplayer, as a single player is an all-round successful and fun game to play. Plus, single player games can't really die, if you know what I mean. So, I thought I should say that just before someone in the comments says, yeah, but the game was focused on single player, so why are you talking about the multiplayer anyway? Well, first off, because I can talk about what I want, and so was Warband. I mean, have you seen the player base on that? That's still got a massive player base, so that's completely irrelevant. But overall, I think we can all agree the single player expansion was great, but the multiplayer, not so much. Now, like I said, I did a survey to get your guys' thoughts on the expansion and what happened to it. Make sure you join my Discord and follow me on Twitter to get involved in that sort of stuff. I'll be posting that. I quite like getting you guys involved because it gets more aspects and people's opinions on it, so I can create a wider viewpoint. So looking at the results, the overwhelming majority of people played over 100 hours on Warband, with most people around 100 to 500 hours on the game. Now, this is Warband, not with Fire and Sword. This is through single player and multiplayer, I might add. And then we had an even amount split between 500 and 1,000 hours, and of course 1,000 plus hours. So we had about 25-ish, 24% evenly on both those hours. So as you can see, most people played Warband for over 100 hours. This is about 90% of the people that did this. How does this translate into with Fire and Sword? These numbers mean nothing on their own. Well, we can see when I ask people the same question about with Fire and Sword, most people played between 0 and 50 hours, and very few people actually played over that 50-hour mark. This says that it didn't have the longevity at all that Warband had. And I wouldn't say that Warband necessarily had all that much more content than with Fire and Sword. I mean, they're very similar games, just put into different time periods. They both have a big single player, and they both have the same-ish type of multiplayer base. Why did so many more people want to play Warband than this new expansion? And I think the words new expansion comes into it quite a bit. I asked people why they thought the multiplayer aspect of with Fire and Sword wasn't as successful as the multiplayer aspects of Native, or of course the very well known multiplayer DLC Napoleonic Wars. Now, there are a lot of responses of course people not really knowing. A lot of people play Mount and Blade that I found from doing these sort of surveys for just the single player. Now, I love the single player of Native and Fire and Sword and a lot of mods and things, but I'm very much a multiplayer guy on the whole. I've probably got a split of about 500 hours on single player and about 800 hours on the multiplayer of Mount and Blade. It's just a side thing, but I thought it was quite a surprise to me that a lot of people have never even touched the multiplayer in their lifetime. And if you haven't, if you're one of those people, I feel like you're definitely missing out. So I sort of got a little bit off topic then. So why do people in Mount and Blade think the multiplayer wasn't as successful as Native on NW? Well, some of the responses were there was no hype for this new game. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Warband came out literally a year before with Fire and Sword. So who's going to go buy Warband after playing the original Mount and Blade, find this new multiplayer aspect of Warband, really enjoy it, and then all of a sudden, a year later, bringing out this new expansion? You're not really going to quite get the hype. People are still busy playing your first game. I mean, I think it's quite granted there's a lot of people looking forward to Bannerlord. But I mean, it's been quite some time. It's probably going to be 9 or 10 years after their last game to when Bannerlord comes out. So it's going to have some hype surrounded it. But a year after, there's not really going to be that hype surrounding this new expansion. And of course, many people have said there's not quite as much difference to Native. As such, NW did this. NW had a massive difference to Native, not just the time period, but the way it played. Having the very balanced and set class system instead of the coin system when you actually bought your stuff added a whole new dynamic and variety, and of course balance to the game. Since it was a solely multiplayer DLC, it needed that balance. And of course, Napoleonic Wars took the multiplayer mantle out of not just of Fire and Sword, but a bit of Native as well. Now, there was another big thing that I found out people really did not like with Fire and Sword, and this was grenades. Yes, it's great having grenades, this new thing in the single player, able to throw them into crowds of AI and blow them up, but it's a bit different when you take that into a multiplayer setting. It completely destroys balance and doesn't make the game fun for everyone, especially if you're wanting to just charge up with people. Just getting blown up straight away and then having to go back to start is not as fun. And especially being able to be one-shotted by pretty much any musket and even arrows to some extent in this expansion completely throws off the balance. Native was more open as well. It was more moddable, since it can be interpreted in very different ways in different periods with different mods. For example, Romans, World War I, Ancient Greece, etc. This was a little bit different with Fire and Sword. It's set in a specific era with specific assets and things that weren't quite as moddable, and this means the longevity, of course, of the expansion isn't going to last as long if not as many people can get in and mod it. And why would you want to mod with Fire and Sword when you can mod Native? I would expect with the more classic and easier assets in Native, it's probably easier to mod than with Fire and Sword as well. I mean, with Fire and Sword, you've got muskets in there. What if you didn't want a mod with muskets? That's not exactly really possible. But with Native, you can have all that stuff, but even if you wanted to add muskets in, you could take that. Anyway, that's just my thoughts. Some more comments from you guys were archers were way too accurate, and without big shields, it made it horrible. Now, I'll get onto this a little bit later when I talk about balancing, but the shields is a big thing with this expansion in terms of balancing, in my experience. Talking a little bit more about balancing, the Swiss had the better armor, and they probably had the best melee weapon. So that's just another comment on why balancing didn't really work out in this expansion. Now, most people said, on the whole, that the players were lower from the get-go. Not even just now, but as soon as it came out, of course, there'd be lower players. Since, like I said, people were still playing Warband at this point. A new expansion wasn't going to draw as many people away from Warband than if they were still playing the original game. And then, of course, just a year after, Napoleonic Wars came out, and this drew a lot more people away from With Fire and Sword. Since there was a massive, big difference between Warband and Napoleonic Wars, why would people really want something in the middle? People either want to play with bow and arrows and swords or muskets. That middle ground doesn't have too much to stand on, especially when it comes to balancing in multiplayer. And furthermore, there wasn't as much interest in the period to keep players in the game. Napoleonic Wars is a very well-known and famous time period. Of course, the medieval era is again. I mean, the sort of age of musketry in the Eastern Europe time period isn't as popular as you might think. Now, what about clans? There wasn't really any events or any community with Fire and Sword, and this is the one thing that has kept NW alive for so long. Native has had these events in community. It has a lot less now, but back in the day it used to have these big events as well. But Native, the sole multiplayer and the public multiplayer was good enough in the sieges and things to keep it going, but it didn't have this in with Fire and Sword. Now, there were events and clans here and there, but not in the same way as NW. Around this time, you forget, Warband was such a moddable game, and people had modded in Mount and Musket. Now, at this time, Mount and Musket was building up its clans for that. It was in the Napoleonic War era, so regiments were coming out of Warband, downloading this mod and making their own events in here. Now, even if some of the regiments did move over to Fire and Sword for a little bit, Mount and Musket was always going to be the more successful mod, since it was set in the Napoleonic, the more popular time era, and had the most clans. And of course, when Napoleonic Wars came out, that was completely it for Mount and Musket. There was no way that players that were in NW regiments were going to spend the majority of their time in With Fire and Sword, since there was this much better DLC for multiplayer that came out at the time. And NW does multiplayer hundreds of times better. It completely overhauls and balances the game. It has maps specific for the multiplayer, where in Fire and Sword, yes, there were specific maps for the expansion, but they weren't very good because they had to try and balance having cavalry, bow and arrows, swords, and muskets. Balancing all those things into a map is very difficult. Napoleonic Wars only had to focus on cavalry and muskets. Native only had to focus sword infantry, cavalry, and melee weapons. They didn't have the whole issues that came with more accurate muskets or the close combat with swords and spears and all that stuff. So why were there no events? Well, except from the whole Napoleonic Wars and Mount and Musket issue, also balance. We're going to go on to this now. Guns versus swords. I mean, that sort of says it all. Different factions don't quite get as good muskets as some factions, or some factions don't even get a good melee stuff. And then some factions are really limited to mostly bows and arrows. You can see the issues already with balancing. From my experience playing, Cav archers are so OP. They can just spam and harass everybody, and I know Native has that, but Native was able to counter it with big, large shields, with Fire and Sword has no counter for it, except other archer cavalry, and that just leads to archer cavalry everywhere, and it seems if you don't play as cav archers, you're absolutely screwed on the battlefield. You might think, oh, muskets could be a good counter to this. Muskets take way too long to reload, so by the time you reload your musket, the archer cav could probably just circle around you, shooting about 6 or 7 arrows off on you until you can reload. The balancing was horrendous. Now, of course, these can be limited in terms of events, but then it moves on to muskets, and how actually the limitations of Napoleonic Wars musketry made it so much better for events. And this is all about moving and reloading. When it comes to gun gameplay, the whole having to stand still while reloading adds so much to it. Not only does it add to tension and fun when you're staying there having to stand still as the enemy is staring you down in a line, and the tension of having to reload before you get shot adds so much to the game, but also in terms of movement, you have to be more specific and more strategic about how you move. Fire and charge wasn't really much of a possibility in Napoleonic Wars and things like that, but in terms of with Fire and Sword, having the ability to fire, carry on moving forward while reloading, fire, carry on moving forward while reloading, fire, does not add any limitations to it, and it just makes a complete mess when it comes to events. And think about it, all the mods that have come out that have given you this ability to move while reloading haven't lasted as long as Napoleonic Wars. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention about going back to the horse cavalry, you might think that in Napoleonic Wars they had dragoons and things with muskets. Dragoons are so inaccurate when on horseback, and of course there's also the thing of reloading. Having that reloading time limits them. And this is the thing. Having something like bows and arrows and muskets in the same game is such a balancing issue, since yes, muskets might do a little bit more damage and they might be a little bit easier to shoot, they're not really that much more accurate. When you're standing still firing your bow and arrow, you're able to shoot it, and if you shoot it within the first few seconds, you get pretty good accuracy. And with muskets, it's the same sort of thing, but in the first few seconds of drawing back a bow, you actually have more accuracy than you do with a musket. On horseback, muskets and archery both have the same amount of accuracy, so they're pretty even there. Yes, while muskets might do a little bit more damage, the amount of arrows you can get off while a musket is reloading is insane, and it completely destroys balance, meaning having lines of muskets and horse archers, the muskets will get absolutely destroyed, meaning cavalry is really a no-go in with Fire and Sword. Now, this is a lot of reasons why I think with Fire and Sword hasn't done so well in the multiplayer, but I would love to know your thoughts. Thank you so much for everyone that participated in the forum, so it's really helped with this video, getting more ideas and viewpoints on it. But if you want to do more things, like I said, go into the description, join my Discord, go and follow me on Twitter, and you will be able to be a part of more of this stuff. But thank you so much for watching. I'd love to see your comments. If we can get this video to 500 likes, that would be brilliant. But thank you, and until then, I will see you in the next one.